The radio crackled with desperation at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Static mixed with gunfire, then silence. Command had lost contact with SEAL Team 6:43 minutes ago, and the storm rolling in from the north made satellite reconnaissance impossible. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, screens flickered with the last known coordinates of the 12-man team, now surrounded by Taliban forces in a valley that didn't appear on any current map. Major Catalina Reaper Voss stood at the back of the briefing room, her flight suit wrinkled from 16 hours of standby alerts. The other pilots avoided eye contact, their conversations dying as she approached. 3 years since the incident in Kandahar, and they still whispered about the woman who'd lost a Hercules to ground fire, who'd walked away from a crash that should have killed everyone aboard. The brass had cleared her, but forgiveness and trust were different currencies in military aviation. Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the tension like shattered glass. We need immediate extraction capabilities for a hot zone. Weather window closes in 90 minutes. The meteorologist's report painted a picture of impossible conditions: 40-knot crosswinds, zero visibility, and a landing strip that existed only in theory. The airfield had been bombed 3 months prior, its runway cratered and swept with debris that could shred tires and collapse landing gear. The mission parameters were suicide dressed up as strategy. 12 SEALs trapped in a kill zone, ammunition running low, medical supplies exhausted. The closest helicopter support was grounded by weather, and conventional aircraft couldn't operate in the mountainous terrain. Someone would have to thread a massive transport plane through mountain passes in zero visibility, land on a surface that barely qualified as Earth, load wounded operators under enemy fire, and somehow lift off again. Every pilot in the room studied their boots or found sudden interest in weather reports. These were men who'd flown combat missions over Baghdad and Kabul, who'd earned distinguished flying crosses and silver stars, but this mission defied the laws of physics and common sense. The mathematics of lift and thrust, wind speed and runway length all pointed to the same conclusion: whoever took this mission wouldn't be coming back. Reaper stepped forward, her boots echoing in the sudden silence. Her hand moved to the worn patch on her shoulder, the faded Grim Reaper insignia that had earned her the call sign 3 deployments ago. Before Kandahar, before the whispers, before she'd become the pilot nobody wanted to fly with but everyone secretly hoped would show up when death was the only alternative. The briefing room held its breath as she approached the mission board, her fingers tracing the impossible coordinates, where 12 of America's finest warriors waited for a miracle that might never come. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "I'll take it," she said, and the room erupted in whispers that sounded suspiciously like prayers. Colonel Morrison's eyes met hers across the tactical display, and she saw something she hadn't seen in 3 years. Hope wrapped in the acknowledgement that desperation made unlikely heroes of broken people. The clock on the wall ticked toward dawn, each second bringing the SEALs closer to their final stand. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains like a banshee's wail, and somewhere in those peaks, 12 men waited for the sound of American engines cutting through the storm. They didn't know their salvation would come from the pilot everyone had written off, the woman whose own squad had nicknamed the Grim Reaper not for the enemies she'd killed, but for her uncanny ability to cheat death itself. Reaper pulled on her flight gloves, each finger finding its familiar place in the worn leather that had seen her through 73 combat missions. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders like the harness of her ejection seat, familiar and terrifying in equal measure. In 30 minutes, she would either prove that redemption could be found at 10,000 feet, or join the SEALs in whatever waited beyond the Valley of Shadows. The storm was coming, but Catalina Voss had flown through worse weather than this. The question wasn't whether she could reach the SEALs, it was whether anyone would be alive when she got there. Morrison handed her the mission folder, his weathered face betraying none of the doubt that filled his eyes. "Reaper," he said quietly, "bring our boys home." She nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of military precision and personal conviction, then turned toward the hangar where her aircraft waited in the pre-dawn darkness. The C-130 Hercules-designated Ghostwriter 7 sat under floodlights like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprop engines gleaming with condensation from the mountain air. The ground crew worked with practiced efficiency, loading medical supplies and ammunition, checking hydraulics and fuel systems, preparing the aircraft for a mission that defied every safety protocol in the book. Staff Sergeant Martinez, her loadmaster, met her at the aircraft with a clipboard and a worried expression. "Ma'am, weather reports are getting worse. Visibility's down to 50 feet in the target area, winds gusting to 45 knots. The strip is—" He paused, searching for diplomatic words. "It's not really a strip anymore, ma'am. Satellite imagery shows maybe 800 feet of usable surface, covered in rubble and standing water." Reaper studied the reconnaissance photos under the harsh hangar lights, her trained eye analyzing approach angles and obstacle clearance. The airfield looked like the surface of the moon, pocked with craters and littered with the twisted remains of Soviet-era aircraft. A normal C-130 required at least 3,000 feet for landing and takeoff under optimal conditions. This mission would require her to stop a 60-ton aircraft in the space of a small parking lot, then somehow get it airborne again with a full load. She ran her fingers along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the patches where shrapnel had been repaired, the small dents and scratches that told the story of previous missions. Ghostwriter 7 had been her bird for 2 years, through dust storms and rocket attacks, through the chaos of emergency evacuations and the precision of tactical insertions. The aircraft knew her touch on the controls, responded to her commands like an extension of her own will. The pre-flight inspection revealed what she expected: a machine pushed to its limits but maintained with obsessive care by ground crews who understood that pilots' lives depended on every bolt and wire. The engines turned over with their familiar whine, instruments came alive with green lights and steady readings, and the radio crackled with early morning traffic from towers across Afghanistan. At 4:45 hours, as the first hint of gray touched the eastern mountains, Ghostwriter 7 taxied toward the active runway. The tower cleared them for immediate departure, the controller's voice tight with professional concern that barely masked personal worry. Other aircraft had attempted similar missions in these mountains. Their wreckage still littered the peaks like metal flowers blooming from stone. The weather report came through the headset as they lined up for takeoff. "Ghostwriter 7, be advised, storm front moving faster than predicted. You'll have maybe 60 minutes on target before conditions become unsurvivable. 60 minutes to find the SEALs, land in impossible conditions, load wounded operators, and escape before the mountains closed like a fist around anyone foolish enough to challenge them." Reaper pushed the throttles forward, feeling 80,000 pounds of American engineering surge down the runway toward a mission that would either cement her legend or end it forever in the valleys of Afghanistan. The C-130 lifted off into darkness that swallowed everything beyond the cockpit, climbing through layers of cloud and turbulence toward coordinates where 12 SEALs waited for a miracle. The aircraft bucked and rolled through mountain thermals, its engines straining against air so thin that every pound of lift had to be fought for and earned. 30 minutes into the flight, the radio crackled with a weak signal from the ground. Any station, this is Trident 6, requesting immediate extraction." The voice was strained, professional despite the background of automatic weapons fire and shouted orders. Master Chief Petty Officer James Havoc Mackenzie's call had traveled through atmosphere and desperation to reach them, a lifeline thrown across impossible distances. Reaper keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the turbulence that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. "Trident 6, this is Ghostwriter 7. I'm 40 mics out with extraction capability. What's your status?" The response came through static mixed with explosions. 3 wounded, ammunition critical, enemy forces closing from 3 sides. The SEALs had maybe 20 minutes before their position became untenable. Martinez worked his way forward from the cargo bay, his face pale in the red cockpit lighting. "Ma'am, we're picking up increased chatter on enemy frequencies. They know something's coming." The Taliban weren't stupid. They'd learned to recognize the sound of American rescue operations, had developed tactics specifically designed to turn extraction attempts into death traps. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral built for giants, their peaks disappearing into clouds that promised worse weather ahead. Reaper flew by instinct and GPS, threading the massive aircraft through passes that seemed too narrow for anything larger than a fighter jet. The C-130 groaned and protested, its frame stressed by maneuvers it was never designed to perform. At 5:30 hours, the valley opened before them like a wound in the earth. Through breaks in the cloud cover, Reaper caught glimpses of the ruined airfield, its cratered runway reflecting the first pale light of dawn. Muzzle flashes sparkled along the ridgelines where Taliban fighters had established overlapping fields of fire, turning the valley into a killing ground that had been months in the making. The SEALs were dug in behind the burned-out shell of a Soviet transport, their position marked by the steady rhythm of M4 carbines and the distinctive crack of a Navy SEAL sniper's rifle. 12 men against what looked like half the Taliban army, fighting with the calm professionalism that had made them legends among America's special operations community. Reaper began her descent, the altimeter spinning backward as Ghost Rider 7 dropped toward Earth at a rate that made Martinez grip his seat and whisper what might have been prayers. The runway rushed up to meet them through the storm, a ribbon of broken concrete and twisted metal that looked more like a combat zone than an airfield. The aircraft touched down hard, its landing gear screaming against damaged concrete as Reaper stood on the brakes and threw the propellers into reverse thrust. 800 feet to stop 60 tons of aircraft, with enemy fire beginning to bracket their position and the clock counting down to extraction or annihilation. They stopped with barely 50 feet to spare, the nose wheel sitting in a puddle of muddy water that reflected the hellish glow of tracer rounds cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Martinez was already lowering the rear ramp, his voice cutting through the chaos. 30 seconds to load. Move, move, move. The SEALs emerged from their defensive positions like ghosts materializing from smoke, carrying their wounded with practiced efficiency while laying down suppressive fire that kept enemy heads down. Master Chief, Mackenzie sprinted toward the aircraft, his tactical gear heavy with extra ammunition and the weight of command decisions that had kept his men alive through the longest night of their lives. His eyes met Reaper's through the cockpit window, and she saw something that surprised her, recognition without surprise, as if he'd known all along that salvation would come wearing Major's leaves and a call sign earned in the crucible of previous impossible missions. Mackenzie had heard the stories, knew the legend of the pilot who'd brought home the dead, and dying when everyone else had given up hope. The loading took 90 seconds that felt like 90 minutes, with Taliban rounds beginning to find their range and the storm front closing in like a living thing determined to trap them in the valley. 3 stretcher cases went in first, SEALs wounded but conscious, their eyes reflecting the kind of pain that came from knowing how close they'd come to never seeing home again. The remaining operators took defensive positions around the aircraft, their weapons adding to the steady rhythm of fire that kept the enemy at bay. These were men who'd spent their careers preparing for moments exactly like this, when training and instinct became the only thing standing between survival and statistics. Martinez's voice cut through the battle noise. All aboard, go, go, go. The ramp began to close as Reaper pushed the throttles forward, feeling the engines respond with a surge of power that vibrated through every rivet and weld in the aircraft's frame. 60 tons of machine and human determination began to roll forward on a runway that seemed to shrink with every passing second. Enemy fire intensified as the Taliban realized their prey was escaping, muzzle flashes erupting along the ridgelines like deadly flowers blooming in the pre-dawn gloom. Rounds sparked off the C-130's armor plating and punched through non-critical systems. Each hit a reminder that they were flying through the valley of the shadow of death with nothing but skill and luck keeping them airborne. The aircraft gathered speed on the damaged runway, its tires finding purchase on broken concrete, while Reaper fought crosswinds that tried to push them into the rocky walls of the valley. The mathematics of flight became a prayer answered in real time. Velocity and lift conquering gravity and fear, American engineering triumphing over the simple desire of desperate men to kill other desperate men. At the last possible moment, with the runway ending in a cliff face that dropped into darkness, Ghost Rider 7 lifted off into air so turbulent it felt like being inside a washing machine filled with lead. The mountains reached for them with fingers of stone and ice, while the storm tried to beat them down with winds that could snap aircraft wings like matchsticks. Behind them, the valley erupted in frustrated gunfire as Taliban fighters realized their ambush had failed, that the Americans had once again slipped through their fingers like smoke through a closed fist. The SEALs were silent in the cargo bay, processing the reality that they were alive when death had seemed certain, that rescue had come from the pilot everyone else had written off. Master Chief Mackenzie made his way forward to the cockpit, his movements careful in the turbulent air. When he reached Reaper's seat, he placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke words that carried more weight than any medal or commendation. "Thank you." 2 words that contained the gratitude of 12 men who would see their families again, who would live to fight another day, because one pilot had been willing to risk everything for brothers in arms. The flight back to Bagram took 53 minutes through weather that would have grounded commercial aviation and tested the limits of military transport. Reaper flew by instrument and instinct, threading the massive aircraft through mountain passes while medics worked on the wounded in the cargo bay behind her. The wounded SEALs were stable, their injuries serious but treatable at the field hospital waiting at Bagram. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in his leg, but was conscious and talking, making jokes that helped ease the tension in the cargo bay. Petty Officer Thompson had a concussion from a near-miss explosion, while Seaman Williams nursed a shoulder wound that would earn him a Purple Heart and a story to tell his grandchildren. The storm followed them home, its leading edge bringing rain that drummed against the aircraft's aluminum skin like applause from the sky itself. Lightning illuminated the clouds around them in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed the majesty and danger of flying through weather that could kill without warning or mercy. At 6:45 hours, Bagram Tower cleared Ghost Rider 7 for final approach, the controller's voice betraying relief that had nothing to do with professional detachment. Word had spread through the base that Reaper had attempted the impossible and somehow succeeded, that the pilot everyone whispered about had just pulled off the kind of mission that became legend. The landing was smooth, a textbook touchdown that belied the chaos of the previous 2 hours. As the aircraft taxied toward the medical facility, ground crews and off-duty personnel lined the taxiways, their silent presence a testament to the brotherhood that connected everyone who wore the uniform, regardless of rank or service branch. The engines wound down with their familiar whine, and for the first time in hours, the world became quiet except for the sound of rain on metal and the distant rumble of thunder moving through the mountains. Martinez secured the aircraft while medics rushed aboard to take custody of the wounded, their professional efficiency masking personal relief that another mission had ended with the living outnumbering the dead. Colonel Morrison appeared at the aircraft's door as the last stretcher was loaded into a waiting ambulance, his weathered face showing emotions that regulations didn't allow him to express in words. He clasped Reaper's hand in both of his, the handshake of a superior officer becoming something more personal, more human in the gray light of an Afghan dawn. "Outstanding work, Major," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official recognition and personal admiration. "The SEALs are asking for you specifically for their debrief. Seems they want to thank the pilot who brought them home." Behind him, Other pilots watched with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe, the kind of respect that could only be earned in moments when death was the expected outcome. Master Chief Mackenzie stood beside his men as they were loaded into ambulances, his tactical gear stained with mud and cordite, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion that came after sustained combat. When he spotted Reaper emerging from the aircraft, he approached with the measured gait of a man who'd learned to husband his strength during the longest nights. "Major Voss," he said, extending his hand, "I've heard the stories about you, about what happened in Kandahar. Want you to know something. Today you proved that heroes aren't defined by the missions they lose, but by the ones they refuse to abandon." His words carried the authority of a man who'd spent 23 years in special operations, who'd seen the best and worst of military aviation. The other SEALs gathered around their leader, 11 men who'd stared death in the face and lived to tell about it, because one pilot had been willing to risk everything for the creed that no one gets left behind. They didn't speak much. Special operations personnel weren't known for long speeches or emotional displays, but their presence spoke volumes about the bond forged in those desperate minutes when survival depended on trusting someone they'd never met. Petty Officer Thompson, his head wrapped in bandages but his eyes clear, stepped forward with something in his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "we'd like you to have this." He extended a patch, the SEAL trident embroidered in gold thread on navy blue fabric, worn edges testifying to its authenticity and significance. "That's from my first deployment," Thompson continued. "Been carrying it for luck for 8 years. Figure it belongs with someone who's got bigger balls than any of us." The other SEALs nodded their agreement, their faces serious in the way of men who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Reaper accepted the patch with the reverence it deserved, understanding that she was being offered membership in a brotherhood that transcended service branches and unit affiliations. The SEAL Trident represented the finest traditions of American special operations, and having it offered by men who'd earned it through blood and sacrifice was an honor that no official commendation could match. As the ambulances pulled away, carrying the wounded toward medical care and eventual recovery, the base began to return to its normal rhythm. But something had changed in those early morning hours, something that would ripple through the military aviation community and eventually reach the highest levels of command. The story of the pilot who'd landed a C-130 on an impossible airstrip, under fire, in weather that should have been unsurvivable, would be told and retold until it became the stuff of legend. But those who'd been there, who'd witnessed the mission firsthand, knew that legends were just stories until someone made them real. Colonel Morrison gathered the mission reports with unusual care, knowing that the paperwork would never capture the full scope of what had happened in that valley. How could official language describe the moment when skill transcended training, when one pilot's refusal to accept defeat had saved 12 lives and restored faith in the proposition that America never abandoned its own? The weather report for the next 6 hours showed conditions unsurvivable for aircraft operations, confirming what everyone already knew. The window for extraction had been measured in minutes, not hours. Any delay, any hesitation, any failure of nerve or skill would have meant writing off 12 SEALs as acceptable losses in an unwinnable war. Instead, those men were alive, receiving medical treatment, calling their families to report that they were safe and would be coming home when their deployment ended. Their children would grow up with fathers, their wives would never receive folded flags, and somewhere in the vast machinery of military record-keeping, a mission classified as impossible had been reclassified as successful. Reaper walked toward her quarters as the sun climbed over the Hindu Kush Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone why dawn was called the hour of hope. Her flight suit was stained with sweat and hydraulic fluid, her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had carried her through the most challenging mission of her career. The other pilots she passed nodded respectfully, their earlier skepticism replaced by the kind of professional admiration reserved for those who'd proven themselves under conditions that left no room for doubt. 3 years of whispers and sideways glances had been erased by 2 hours of flying that redefined what was possible when courage met skill in the crucible of combat. In her quarters, Reaper carefully placed the sealed trident patch on her desk beside the other mementos that marked the milestones of her military career. The Distinguished Flying Cross from her first deployment, the Air Medal with Combat V from her second tour, the Purple Heart she'd earned in Kandahar when ground fire had turned her aircraft into a falling meteor, and somehow she'd kept it flying long enough to save her crew. Each decoration told part of her story, but none captured the full measure of what it meant to be a military aviator in an age when wars were fought by professionals who volunteered to serve knowing that the next mission might be their last. The seal patch represented something different, recognition from peers who understood that heroism wasn't about seeking glory, but about refusing to quit when quitting would be the rational choice. The shower was hot and endless, washing away the physical residue of the mission while leaving the emotional weight intact. The face in the mirror showed 34 years of life that included 8 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, 74 successful missions, and 1 catastrophic failure that had nearly ended her career, and definitely ended her faith in the fairness of military justice. Kandahar had been different. The intelligence had been wrong, the enemy presence vastly underestimated, and the extraction landing zone had turned into a kill zone before her landing gear touched the ground. She'd gotten most of her passengers out alive, had kept a burning aircraft flying through sheer force of will and superior training, but 4 soldiers had died, and the official investigation had focused more on assigning blame than learning from mistakes. The Board of Inquiry had cleared her of wrongdoing, but clearing and exonerating were different things in the tight-knit world of military aviation. Whispers followed her from base to base, suggestions that she'd pushed too hard, taken unnecessary risks, prioritized mission accomplishment over crew safety. The fact that her actions had saved 36 lives seemed less important than the 4 lives that had been lost. But today had been different. Today she'd proven that experience bought with blood was the most valuable currency in combat aviation, that the pilot who'd learned to fly through hell was exactly the pilot you wanted when hell was the only route home. The SEALs didn't care about her past failures. They cared that she'd shown up when everyone else had found reasons to stay home. The knock on her door came at 800 hours, followed by the distinctive voice of her squadron commander. "Reaper, you in there? Got some people who want to talk to you." Colonel Morrison's tone was carefully neutral, the voice of a commander who'd learned not to telegraph good news or bad until he was certain which category applied. She opened the door to find Morrison accompanied by 2 men in civilian clothes, whose bearing and haircuts marked them as military intelligence despite their attempt at appearing like contractors or diplomats. Behind them stood Master Chief Mackenzie, his uniform now clean but his face still showing the strain of the previous night's action. "Major Voss," Morrison began, "I'd like you to meet Colonel James Patterson from Special Operations Command and Mr. David Chen from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They've flown in specifically to debrief this morning's mission." The implications were clear. Her successful extraction had attracted attention from levels of command that normally didn't concern themselves with individual tactical operations. Patterson stepped forward, his handshake firm and brief. "Major, that was exceptional work this morning. We're hoping you can walk us through your decision-making process, help us understand how you accomplished what our initial analysis suggested was impossible." His tone was professional but not unfriendly, the voice of someone who'd seen enough combat operations to distinguish between lucky accidents and superior skill. The debriefing took 3 hours and covered every aspect of the mission, from initial planning through final touchdown. Reaper walked them through her analysis of weather conditions, her assessment of runway limitations, her modifications to standard approach procedures, and her real-time adaptations to enemy fire and mechanical difficulties. What emerged from the detailed questioning was a picture of military aviation at its finest. Training and experience combining to create split-second decisions that looked like magic to outside observers, but followed logical progressions invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to think in 3 dimensions, while managing multiple life-threatening variables simultaneously. Mackenzie provided the ground perspective, describing the tactical situation from the SEAL's point of view and confirming details that validated Reaper's analysis of the mission parameters. His account painted a picture of a desperate situation saved by precise flying and perfect timing, the kind of military operation that succeeded because every participant performed beyond their normal capabilities when failure meant death. Patterson's final question cut to the heart of what made the mission significant. Major, in your professional opinion, could this extraction have been accomplished by any other pilot in your squadron? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, carrying implications that extended far beyond one morning's work in the mountains of Afghanistan. Reaper considered her answer carefully, understanding that false modesty would be as inappropriate as boastful exaggeration. Sir, any pilot in this squadron has the technical skills to attempt this mission. Whether they would have succeeded depends on variables I can't evaluate. Their comfort level with extreme weather, their experience with combat landings, their willingness to exceed normal safety parameters when lives are at stake. Her response satisfied the intelligence officers while earning a slight nod of approval from Mackenzie, who'd spent enough time around special operations personnel to recognize the difference between confidence and arrogance. Confidence was what had brought his men home. Arrogance would have gotten them all killed in the first 30 seconds of the approach. The debriefing concluded with Patterson making notes in a classified folder that would eventually find its way to decision-makers whose names didn't appear on organization charts. The morning's mission would be analyzed and dissected, its lessons incorporated into training programs and tactical doctrines, its success used to justify equipment purchases and personnel decisions that would affect military aviation for years to come. But for the 12 SEALs recovering in the base hospital, the mission's significance was simpler and more personal. They were alive because one pilot had been willing to risk everything for the principle that no American service member gets left behind. That principle had been tested in a valley surrounded by enemies, during a storm that made flying suicidal, on a runway that existed more in hope than reality. The principle had survived the test, preserved by skill and courage, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had characterized American military operations since the Continental Army crossed the Delaware on a winter night when victory seemed impossible. Some traditions were worth preserving regardless of the cost, and the tradition of bringing everyone home was one of them. As the intelligence officers prepared to leave, Patterson turned back to Reaper with a question that wasn't part of the official debriefing. Major, we're putting together a new unit, pilots with special operations experience who can handle missions that fall outside normal parameters. Would you be interested in hearing more about it? The offer hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape her career and restore the reputation that had been damaged in Kandahar. Special operations meant higher clearances, more challenging missions, and the kind of flying that separated aviators from pilots who happened to know how to work the controls. Sir, she replied, I'd be honored to serve wherever the Air Force needs me most. The response was diplomatically correct while leaving room for negotiation, the kind of answer that kept options open while expressing appropriate enthusiasm. Patterson smiled, the expression of someone who'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. The meeting broke up with handshakes and promises to follow up through official channels, the kind of professional courtesy that marked the end of successful military interactions. Mackenzie lingered after the others had left, his presence indicating that he had something to say that wasn't appropriate for official ears. "Major," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in special operations, "want you to know that word about this morning is already spreading through the community. SEALs talk to Rangers, Rangers talk to Delta, Delta talks to everyone else. By next week, every special operations pilot in theater is going to know your name and what you did for us." His words carried implications that extended far beyond personal recognition. In the insular world of special operations, reputation was currency, and having the respect of ground operators who trusted you with their lives was worth more than any official commendation. The SEALs had just given her something that couldn't be earned through training or granted through promotion: acceptance as a member of the brotherhood that connected everyone who'd chosen to serve in units where the mission came first and personal survival was always secondary. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities that felt surreal after the morning's intensity. Equipment maintenance, flight planning, weather briefings, and administrative tasks that kept military aviation functioning between the moments when everything depended on superior flying and superior luck working in perfect harmony. But underneath the routine, something fundamental had changed. Other pilots sought her out for advice on extreme, whether flying, ground crews worked with extra care on her aircraft, and the base commander himself stopped by to offer personal congratulations on a mission that would be studied in military academies for years to come. The real measure of the morning's success wasn't found in official recognition or career advancement opportunities. It was found in the phone calls made by 12 SEALs to their families, conversations that began with "I'm okay" and continued with stories that would be told and retold until they became family legends passed down through generations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called his wife in San Diego, his voice breaking as he described the moment when American engines had cut through the storm to announce that salvation had arrived wearing turboprops and flown by someone who'd refused to accept that the mission was impossible. Petty Officer Thompson's daughter would grow up hearing about the pilot who'd landed a giant airplane on a broken runway while people shot at them, how her father had been saved by someone brave enough to fly through the worst storm anyone could remember. The story would inspire her to become a pilot herself, continuing a cycle of service that connected generations of Americans who'd chosen to risk everything for the principle that freedom wasn't free. Seaman Williams wrote a letter to his parents that would be framed and hung in their living room, a testament to the moment when training and courage had combined to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. His words tried to capture what it felt like to be rescued by someone who'd already proven herself in the crucible of combat, who'd earned the right to be called heroic through actions rather than publicity. Master Chief Mackenzie's report to Naval Special Warfare Command would become required reading for officers responsible for planning extraction operations. Its clinical language unable to fully convey the drama of those desperate hours, when 12 SEALs had held off superior forces, while waiting for a miracle that arrived disguised as a C-130 Hercules flown by a major with a reputation for accomplishing the impossible. The mission's ripple effects extended beyond personal stories and official reports. The successful extraction proved that American military aviation had retained the capability to operate in conditions that should have been prohibitive, that training and equipment had produced pilots capable of exceeding the normal limitations of physics and probability when American lives hung in the balance. Defense contractors would study the mission parameters to develop new training scenarios, their computer simulations trying to recreate the conditions that had made the morning's extraction both necessary and successful. The data would influence aircraft design requirements, pilot selection criteria, and the kind of specialized training that prepared aviators for missions where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds and feet. But perhaps the most important outcome was intangible: the restoration of faith in the proposition that American military forces never abandoned their own. In an era when public support for military operations fluctuated with political winds and media coverage, The successful extraction reminded everyone involved that some principles transcended politics and opinion polls. The 12 SEALs who'd been pulled from that valley represented more than just individual lives saved. They symbolized the commitment that connected every person who'd ever worn the uniform, the promise that service meant something beyond just a job or a career choice. That promise had been tested in the crucible of combat and had emerged stronger than ever. As evening approached over Bagram airfield, the sun setting behind mountains that had witnessed empires rise and fall, Major Catalina, Reaper, Voss walked the flight line one final time before heading to the officers' club where her squadron mates were waiting with questions and congratulations that would stretch late into the night. Her aircraft sat under floodlights, ground crews performing post-flight maintenance with the careful attention that all combat aircraft required after missions that pushed them to their operational limits. Bullet holes had been patched, hydraulic lines checked, engines inspected for damage that could ground the aircraft until replacement parts arrived from halfway around the world. Ghost Rider 7 bore the scars of the morning's mission like badges of honor, each mark a testament to the violence they'd flown through and survived. The aircraft had performed flawlessly under conditions that would have challenged its designers' wildest stress test scenarios, proving once again that American engineering could be trusted to bring American warriors home from places where coming home required nothing short of a miracle. The SEAL Trident patch was safely secured in Reaper's quarters, but its significance went far beyond the fabric and thread from which it was constructed. The patch represented acceptance into a brotherhood that measured worth through actions rather than words, that judged character through performance under pressure rather than peacetime accomplishments. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that American military aviation remained the world's finest, because it was flown by people who understood that excellence wasn't a destination, but a journey that required constant rededication to principles that didn't change with fashion or convenience. The war in Afghanistan would eventually end, the bases would be closed, and the equipment would be shipped home or transferred to allies who'd continue fighting battles that seemed to have no final resolution. But the mission flown that morning would live on in the memories of everyone who'd been touched by it, a reminder that heroism wasn't defined by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to act decisively when others depended on your skill.